his war for her soul and body. Caterina Esposito had spent her entire life preparing for marriage, a cold, calculated deal to keep alliances intact. But the night before the wedding, she was taken by a man who had no right to touch her. Enzo Costa's breath was warm against her throat as he whispered, "You were never meant to be his, Dolcezza." His fingers trailed down her spine. "Now, you never will be." Chapter 1. The eve of unwanted promises. The air in the Villa Esposito hung heavy with the scent of lilies and impending doom. Caterina Esposito traced the delicate lace of her wedding gown, the ivory fabric a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within her. 57 years she had lived, a lifetime of quiet obedience, of adhering to the rigid structure of the Esposito family. Tomorrow, she would become Caterina Bellini, a wife in name only, a pawn in the endless game of power between two of Sicily's oldest mafia families. The mirror reflected a woman who seemed both familiar and foreign. Her silver-streaked hair, usually worn in a severe bun, cascaded down her back, a concession to the occasion. Her face, though etched with the lines of time and a quiet sadness, still held a flicker of the fiery spirit that had been systematically suppressed since her youth. Her eyes, a deep, soulful brown, held a glint of defiance, a spark she thought had been extinguished long ago. She remembered her first love, Antonio, a boy with laughing eyes and a reckless grin, who had stolen her heart with stolen kisses and whispered promises under the Sicilian moon. He wasn't Famiglia, of course. He was a fisherman's son, a world away from the Esposito empire. Their fleeting romance had ended abruptly, tragically. A car accident, they'd said. But Caterina had always suspected her father's hand, a silent warning against straying from the prescribed path. The memory, though decades old, still ached with a raw, unfinished grief. Now, she was to marry Salvatore Bellini, a man old enough to be her father, a man whose cruelty was whispered about in hushed tones even within the heavily guarded walls of the Esposito villa. He was a widower, his first wife having died under circumstances that were never fully explained. Caterina knew she was being offered as a sacrifice, a guarantee of peace, a strengthening of the alliance between the Espositos and the Bellinis. Her brother, Marco, the current head of the family, had made that abundantly clear. "It's for the good of the family, Caterina," he had said, his voice devoid of any real warmth. "You understand, don't you?" She understood. She had always understood. Her life was not her own. It belonged to the family, to the intricate web of obligations and expectations that define their existence. The villa bustled with activity. Maids scurried about, their whispers a constant hum in the background. Caterina could hear the clinking of glasses, the murmur of voices from the courtyard below, where the pre-wedding celebrations were already underway. The sounds of forced gaiety grated on her nerves. She longed for silence, for escape, for a moment to breathe without the suffocating weight of her impending fate. She walked to the balcony, overlooking the sprawling gardens. The scent of jasmine and orange blossoms mingled with the salty tang of the sea, a bittersweet reminder of the beauty that surrounded her, a beauty she felt increasingly detached from. The moon, a sliver in the inky sky, cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. She leaned against the cool stone railing, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. A sudden noise, a rustling in the bushes below, made her jump. She peered into the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, tall and imposing. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Even in the dim light, she could see the intensity of his gaze, a gaze that seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed facade. He was a stranger, yet there was something unsettlingly familiar about him. His face was strong, angular, with a shadow of stubble darkening his jaw. His hair was dark, almost black, and his eyes, even from this distance, seemed to burn with an unsettling fire. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, but there was an air of danger about him, a sense of barely controlled power. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he raised a hand, A single finger pressed to his lips, a silent command for her to be quiet. Katerina found herself unable to move, unable to speak, caught in the web of his presence. He melted back into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Katerina breathless and strangely unsettled. Who was he? And what was he doing in her family's heavily guarded villa? A shiver ran down her spine, a premonition of something momentous, something life-altering, about to happen. The carefully orchestrated world she had known all her life seemed to tilt on its axis, threatening to crumble around her. She took a deep breath with the aim to stabilize herself, but the scent of the man below, something woody and dangerous, stayed with her. The carefully placed lilies around her, meant to soothe, began to cloy and disgust. The feeling of his gaze lingered on her skin, a strange, burning heat. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades, a feeling that awakened something deep within her, something she thought had long been buried. The defiance she had glimpsed in the mirror earlier returned, stronger now, fueled by this unexpected encounter. She turned away from the balcony, her heart still racing. She had a decision to make. She could continue down the path that had been laid out for her, a path of duty and obligation, of a loveless marriage to a cruel man. Or she could what? She didn't know. But the image of the man in the shadows, his intense gaze, his silent command, had planted a seed of rebellion, a seed of hope, in the barren landscape of her soul. She did not want to be that woman in the mirror any longer. And as she glanced back at the expensive and expertly tailored wedding dress, that seed of hope was quickly taking root. Tonight, the carefully crafted plans of two powerful families felt less like an inevitability and more like a challenge. The rustling of the silk was no longer the promise of a new life, but the sound of shedding an old skin. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Sicilian Night. The knock on her door was soft, hesitant. Signorina Katerina? It was Rosa, her lifelong maid, her voice laced with a familiar blend of concern and deference. Come in, Rosa, Katerina said, turning away from the window. She had been staring out into the darkness, trying to make sense of the unsettling encounter in the garden. The image of the man, his face a blur in the shadows, his eyes burning with an unknown intensity, was etched into her mind. Rosa entered, her wrinkled face etched with worry. They are asking for you downstairs, Signorina. Your brother, she trailed off, her eyes darting nervously towards the door. Katerina knew what that meant. Marco was impatient. He wanted to parade her before the guests, to display his dutiful sister, the final piece in his carefully constructed alliance. The thought made her stomach churn. Tell him I'll be down shortly, Katerina said, her voice firmer than she felt. She needed a few more moments, a few more breaths of freedom before she descended into the suffocating atmosphere of the pre-wedding celebrations. Rosa hesitated. Signorina, he is not in a good mood. Katerina sighed. I understand, Rosa. Just give me 5 minutes. Rosa nodded, relief flooding her face. She closed the door softly behind her, leaving Katerina alone once more. She walked to the dressing table, picking up a silver-backed hairbrush, a gift from her mother, long dead. She brushed her hair, the rhythmic strokes a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim some control over her own body, her own life. She looked at her reflection, at the woman staring back at her, a woman on the cusp of a precipice. She had always been a creature of habit, of routine. But the encounter in the garden had shaken her, had awakened something dormant within her. A yearning for something more, something different, something real. Suddenly, a faint sound, a soft click, made her freeze. It came from the balcony. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The French doors, which she had left slightly ajar, were now fully open. A figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, the same man from the garden. He stepped into the room, his movements fluid and silent, like a predator entering its prey's lair. He closed the doors behind him, the click echoing in the sudden silence. He was closer now, and she could see him more clearly. He was even more imposing than she had imagined. His face was hard, chiseled, with a strong jawline and a mouth that seemed set in a perpetual line of grim determination. But it was his eyes that held her captive, dark and intense, filled with a mixture of danger and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher.
"Who are you?"
Katerina asked, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to sound brave, to project an air of authority, but she knew she was failing. He didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, studying her, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe, as if assessing her, weighing her up. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resonant, with a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "You know who I am, Katerina."
She frowned.
"I don't. I've never seen you before in my life." He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Perhaps not.
"But you know of me."
Info Costa." The name hit her like a physical blow.
Costa.
The rivals. The enemies. The family that had been locked in a bitter feud with the Espositos for generations. A feud that had claimed countless lives, including, she suspected, Antonio's. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This was madness. He was the enemy. He shouldn't be here. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, overwhelming her senses. She could smell him now, a blend of expensive cologne and something darker, something more primal, a scent that reminded her of the wild, untamed landscape of Sicily. "I came for you," he said, his voice soft, yet laced with steel. Katerina's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This was a nightmare. He was going to kill her. She was sure of it. A final, brutal act of revenge in the endless cycle of violence between their families.
"Why?"
she managed to ask, her voice trembling. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. She flinched, expecting a blow, but he simply traced the line of her jaw with his fingertip, a surprisingly gentle touch that sent a shiver down her spine. "Because you were never meant to be his, Dulcezza," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "You were meant to be mine." His words, his touch, the sheer audacity of his presence, shattered the last vestiges of her composure. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of fear, of confusion, of a strange, unexpected longing. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "Don't cry, Katerina. I'm not going to hurt you." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to find some truth, some reassurance in his dark, enigmatic gaze. But she found only mystery, only a dangerous, alluring unknown. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her forehead, a soft, fleeting kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her body. "Now," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion, "you never will be." He took another step. The movement was so fast, so precise, that she had no way to defend. He was not here to kill her. He was here to take her. And before she could even scream, a black cloth was pressed over her nose and mouth. A cloying, sweet smell filled her nostrils. She fought, a brief, desperate struggle, but it was no use. The darkness closed in, swallowing her whole. Chapter 3. A Cage of Gilded Iron. Katerina awoke to the gentle rocking of a boat and the sound of waves lapping against the hull. Her head throbbed, a dull ache that pulsed behind her eyes. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. She was lying on a soft bed, covered with a thick, luxurious blanket. The air was cool and damp, and the scent of the sea filled her nostrils. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light that filtered through a small porthole. She was in a cabin, a small but opulent space, decorated with rich fabrics and dark wood paneling. It was a beautiful prison, a cage of gilded iron. The events of the previous night came flooding back, a jumbled mess of fear, confusion, and a strange, unexpected thrill. Info Costa. The enemy. The man who had stolen her from her own home, from her impending marriage, from the life she had always known. She remembered his face, his intense gaze, his touch, his words. You were never meant to be his, Dulcetsa. You were meant to be mine. The words echoed in her mind, a dangerous promise, a terrifying threat. She tried to sit up again, this time managing to push herself up on her elbows. Her head swam, and she had to close her eyes for a moment, waiting for the dizziness to pass. She was still wearing the clothes she had been wearing the previous night, her silk nightgown and robe, now rumpled and creased. The door to the cabin opened, and Enzo Costa stepped inside. He was dressed in dark trousers and a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, tanned forearms. He looked even more imposing in the daylight, his presence filling the small space, leaving little room for her to breathe. He stood there for a moment, watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, he walked over to the bed, his movements fluid and graceful, like a panther stalking its prey. You're awake, he said, his voice low and resonant. It wasn't a question. Katerina didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip slightly. He was close, too close, his presence overwhelming her senses. She could smell his cologne, a subtle, masculine scent that mingled with the salty tang of the sea air. How are you feeling? He asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Where am I? Katerina asked, ignoring his question. Her voice was hoarse, her throat dry. You're safe, he said. That's all that matters. Safe? She scoffed. I'm your prisoner. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Perhaps. But you're also my guest. I don't want to be your guest, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I want to go home. His smile faded. This is your home now, Katerina. With me. His words sent a shiver down her spine. This was madness. He was insane. He couldn't possibly believe that she would simply accept this, that she would willingly become his captive. His what? His lover? His wife. You can't keep me here, she said, trying to sound brave, to project an air of authority, but she knew she was failing. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. She flinched, expecting a blow, but he simply tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a surprisingly gentle touch that sent a tremor through her body. I can do anything I want, Katerina, he said, his voice soft, yet laced with steel. You belong to me now. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to find some sign of weakness, some crack in his facade. But she found only determination, only a fierce, unwavering resolve. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her forehead, a soft, fleeting kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her body. Because I've wanted you for a long time, Katerina, he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. Longer than you can possibly imagine. He stood up, his movements abrupt, breaking the spell that had momentarily held her captive. I'll leave you to rest, he said. I'll have someone bring you some food. He walked to the door, then paused, turning back to look at her. Don't try to escape, Katerina, he said, his voice hardening. It would be unwise. He left, closing the door behind him, leaving Katerina alone in her gilded cage. She sat there, staring at the closed door, her mind reeling. She was trapped, a prisoner of a man she barely knew, a man who was her family's sworn enemy. But amidst the fear, the confusion, there was also a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite define. A strange, unexpected excitement, a sense of being alive, truly alive, for the first time in decades. The boat continued on. She had no idea what awaited her, but her old life was a distant shore she could never revisit. Her life now was bound to the man who had stolen her, and as the boat cut through the waves, she knew that every splash was a step further into a perilous, unknown future. And despite everything, a part of her, a part she had long suppressed, was thrilling with anticipation. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Forgotten Life. The food arrived, brought by a silent, middle-aged woman with wary eyes and a tightly drawn mouth. She placed the tray on a small table near the bed, her movements quick and efficient, avoiding Katerina's gaze. The tray held a simple meal: crusty bread, fresh cheese, olives, and a bowl of steaming minestrone. The aroma was enticing, but Katerina's stomach churned with anxiety. She wasn't hungry. The woman left without a word, closing the door softly behind her. Katerina stared at the food, her mind racing. She had to think, to plan, to find a way to escape. But her thoughts were a jumbled mess, a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. She got out of bed, her legs still shaky. She walked to the porthole, peering out at the endless expanse of the sea. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. It was a breathtaking sight, but Katerina felt no joy, only a profound sense of loneliness and isolation. She touched the cool glass of the porthole, her fingers tracing the outline of the frame. She imagined herself back at the Villa Esposito, surrounded by her family, by the familiar routines of her life. But the image felt distant, unreal, as if it belonged to another lifetime, another person. She remembered her childhood, playing in the gardens, hiding amongst the lemon trees, her laughter echoing through the warm Sicilian air. She remembered her mother, her gentle smile, her soothing voice, singing her lullabies in the soft twilight. She remembered Antonio, his laughing eyes, his whispered promises, their stolen moments of joy before the darkness descended. All those memories, once vivid and precious, now seemed faded, like old photographs, their colors bleached by time and loss. Enzo Costa had stolen more than just her freedom. He had stolen her past, her identity, everything that had defined her. She turned away from the porthole, her eyes falling on the tray of food. She realized she was starving. She sat down at the table, forcing herself to eat, to keep up her strength. She needed to be clear-headed, to be ready for any opportunity that might present itself. As she ate, she examined the cabin more closely. It was small, but luxurious, with a comfortable bed, a writing desk, a small wardrobe, and a private bathroom. There were no obvious exits, apart from the door and the porthole, which was too small to climb through. She finished her meal, feeling slightly stronger, more grounded. She needed a plan. She couldn't simply wait for Enzo to decide her fate. She had to take control, to fight back. She walked to the writing desk, opening the drawers. They were empty, except for a few sheets of blank paper and a single pen. She picked up the pen, testing its weight in her hand. It was a beautiful object, made of heavy silver, with intricate engravings. It felt like a weapon, a tool she could use to defend herself. She sat down at the desk, staring at the blank paper. She could write a letter, a plea for help. But who would she address it to? Her brother? He was the one who had arranged her marriage, who had offered her up as a sacrifice. He wouldn't help her. The police? They were corrupt, controlled by the mafia families. They wouldn't dare interfere. She realized she was truly alone, utterly dependent on her own wits and courage. She had to find a way to escape. To return to what? She no longer knew. Her old life was gone, shattered beyond repair. But she wouldn't, accept this new life, this captivity, this forced relationship with the enemy. She began to write, not a letter, but a diary, a record of her thoughts, her feelings, her fears, her hopes. She wrote about Enzo, about his strange, unsettling presence, about his words, his touch, about the mixture of terror and fascination he evoked in her. She wrote about Antonio, about their lost love, about the pain that still lingered, decades after his death. She wrote about her family, about the suffocating weight of their expectations, about the life she had always known, a life that had been stolen from her, first by her father and now by Enzo Costa. As she wrote, the tears flowed freely, tears of grief, of anger, of a profound sense of loss. But amidst the tears, there was also a sense of release, a sense of catharsis. Writing was a way to reclaim her voice, to assert her identity, to refuse to be silenced, to refuse to be defined by others. The pen scratched against the paper, a small, defiant sound in the silence of the cabin. Katerina continued, as a form of self-preservation. The rhythmic movement was a small act of agency in her gilded cage. The sun had long since set, and the cabin was plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the porthole. Outside, she heard footsteps approach. Her grip tightened on the pen. Katerina wrote until her hand ached and her eyes burned. She wrote until she had poured out her soul onto the paper, until she had transformed her pain, her fear, her anger into words, into a testament to her resilience, her determination to survive. Chapter 5. The Scent of Oranges and Gunpowder. The door opened, and Enzo stood there, silhouetted against the light from the corridor. He held a single candle, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on his face, making him look even more enigmatic, more dangerous. "I thought you might be asleep," he said, his voice low and husky. Katerina quickly closed the diary, placing the pen on top of it, as if to protect her words, her secrets, from his prying eyes. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. He entered the cabin, closing the door behind him. He placed the candle on the writing desk, the soft light illuminating the small space, chasing away some of the shadows. He was wearing a dark sweater now, which emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his body. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "Are you feeling better?" he asked. Katerina hesitated. She didn't want to show him any weakness, any vulnerability. But she also knew that lying would be pointless. He was too perceptive, too astute. He would see through her pretense. "I'm adjusting," she said, choosing her words carefully. He nodded, as if he understood. He walked over to the porthole, staring out at the dark expanse of the sea. The moonlight reflected in his eyes, making them seem almost luminous. "We're heading towards my home," he said, his voice quiet, almost reflective. "It's on a small island, off the coast of Sicily. It's secluded." Katerina didn't respond. She didn't want to know about his home, about his life. She wanted to escape, to return to somewhere. Anywhere but here. He turned back to her, his expression softening. "I know this is difficult for you, Katerina," he said. "I know you're afraid. But I promise you, I won't hurt you. I just want to get to know you, to give you a chance to get to know me." His words surprised her. She had expected threats, violence, perhaps even rape. But he seemed genuinely sincere. Or was it just a clever ruse, a way to lull her into a false sense of security?
"Why?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why me? Why now?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's a long story, Katerina," he said. "A complicated story. One that involves our families, our history, our destiny." He walked over to the bed, sitting down beside her. He was close, too close, his presence filling her senses. She could smell his cologne, a subtle, masculine scent, but now it was mingled with something else, something sharper, more acrid. The scent of gunpowder. She realized he must have been handling a weapon recently. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. He was a dangerous man, a killer, a member of a brutal, unforgiving world. And yet, there was also something about him, something that drew her in, that fascinated her, that made her heart beat faster. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She knew she was playing with fire, that she was venturing into dangerous territory. But she couldn't help herself. She needed to understand, to make sense of this madness. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity, her willingness to listen. Then, he began to speak, his voice low and measured, telling her a story of two families locked in a bitter feud for generations, a feud that had started with a stolen piece of land, a broken promise, a betrayal. He spoke of his father, a powerful, ruthless man who had ruled the Costa family with an iron fist. He spoke of his mother, a beautiful, gentle woman who had died when he was young, a victim of the endless cycle of violence. He spoke of his own childhood, growing up in the shadow of the feud, learning to fight, to kill, to survive. He spoke of Katerina's family, the Espositos, his family's sworn enemies. He spoke of her father, a man he had never met, but whom he had been taught to hate, to despise. He spoke of her brother, Marco, the current head of the family, a man he considered weak, indecisive, unworthy of his position. He spoke of the arranged marriage, the alliance between the Espositos and the Bellinis, a move that threatened to upset the delicate balance of power in the Sicilian underworld. A move that he could not allow. He spoke, at last, of Antonio, Caterina's first love, a ghost from her past, and Enzo's, too. I always knew, he spoke, his voice low and rumbling with unspoken things, that I would never let you go through with it. He paused, staring down at his hands before lifting his face. The emotion in his eyes was stark. It was a naked vulnerability that had Caterina holding her breath. It was a mixture of rage, grief, and something softer. He was my cousin, Enzo said, his voice thick with emotion. My closest friend.
He told me about you.
About your secret meetings, your stolen kisses, your love. He paused, his jaw clenching. He was careless. He trusted the wrong people. He paid the price. Caterina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was true. Antonio. Enzo's cousin. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, a horrifying, heartbreaking picture emerging from the shadows. She now also knew for certain who had been behind that accident. So it was you? She began, tears gathering. Enzo met her eyes. He did not look away.
No, dolcezza.
His voice was raw and hoarse. But I wasn't strong enough then to stop it. I was too young. His jaw tightened. He spoke of you often. Of one day, leaving all of this, he gestured around the cabin, the sea beyond, behind, taking you away from it. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, strong, surprisingly gentle. She didn't pull away. I'm not doing this for revenge, Caterina, he said, his voice earnest, pleading. I'm doing this for him. And for you. To give you the life he wanted you to have. A life free from all this darkness. He fell silent as his words hung heavy in the small room. It was a revelation that shook Caterina to her core, opening old wounds and yet, strangely, offering a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in decades. Hope, twisted and dangerous as it might be. The scent of oranges, from the small bowl on the desk, mingled with the lingering scent of gunpowder, a symbol of the life she had been pulled into, a life where beauty and violence were inextricably intertwined. She looked at Enzo, really looked at him, seeing not just the enemy, but a man haunted by his past, a man driven by a complex mixture of duty, guilt, and perhaps something more. Chapter 6. Beneath the Scars of Loyalty. Caterina stared at Enzo, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the ruthless mafioso with the grieving cousin, the man who spoke of a life free from darkness. His words, his confession, had thrown her carefully constructed world into further disarray. She didn't know what to believe, what to trust. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. You steal me away, you hold me captive, and you tell me you're doing this for Antonio? For me? He squeezed her hand, his touch surprisingly reassuring. I know it sounds insane, Caterina, but I promise you, I'll explain everything.
Just give me time. Give me a chance.
She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw pain there, and regret, but also a strange kind of sincerity, a vulnerability that she hadn't expected. She remembered Antonio, his laughing eyes, his gentle touch, his dreams of a different life. Could Enzo be telling the truth? Could he be, in his own twisted way, trying to fulfill Antonio's wishes, to give her the life he had been denied? Time is something I have little of, Caterina replied, her voice gaining a little strength. My family, they will be looking for me. Salvatore Bellini, he will not take this lightly. Enzo's expression hardened. Let them look. They won't find you. And Bellini, he is nothing. He is a relic of the past, a man clinging to power that is slipping through his fingers. He is dangerous, Caterina insisted. He has influence. Enzo dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. He is nothing that I fear. I have protected you from him, Caterina.
You are safe with me.
His confidence, his arrogance, both infuriated and intrigued her. He was so sure of himself, so certain of his power. But there was also something protective in his demeanor, something that made her feel, against her better judgment, a flicker of security. "And what about my family?" she asked. "My brother, he will be worried." She knew this was a lie. Marco cared more about the alliance than he did about her well-being. But she needed to know Enzo's intentions, to understand the game he was playing. Enzo's expression darkened. "Your brother is a fool," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "He would have sacrificed you to that pig, Bellini, for the sake of his own ambition. He doesn't deserve your loyalty." His words stung, but Caterina couldn't deny their truth. She had always known, deep down, that her brother's loyalty was to the family, to the power, not to her. "But they are still my family," she said, her voice weak. Enzo sighed, releasing her hand. He stood up, walking over to the porthole, staring out at the darkness. "Family," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "It's a word that has been twisted, corrupted, used to justify all manner of sins. Loyalty, honor, duty, they are just chains, Caterina, chains that bind us to the past, to the mistakes of our fathers." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. "I want to break those chains, Caterina. I want to create something new, something different. A life where we are free to choose our own destiny, to love who we want, to live without fear." His words were seductive, alluring, like a siren song. He was offering her a glimpse of a different world, a world where she could escape the suffocating constraints of her old life, where she could be free to be herself, to love, to live. But she knew it was a dangerous illusion, a mirage in the desert. He was a mafioso, a killer, a man steeped in violence and betrayal. He could not offer her true freedom, only a different kind of cage, a cage of his own making. She had to make him let his guard down. "And how do you propose to do that?" she asked. "By starting with us," he responded, taking a step back toward her. "Us?" she echoed, her voice a whisper. Enzo sat back down. He looked at her in a way she wasn't sure she had ever been looked at before. "I know I took you by force, Caterina, and I am not sorry." The bluntness of his honesty surprised her, but he continued before she could speak. "But I want you to stay willingly. I want you to choose me. And if I don't?" she asked, meeting his eyes. The air thickened between them. It was a challenge and an invitation. He moved closer, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath, smell that dangerous scent that clung to him. "Then I will spend every moment proving to you that you should." He said it softly, but with the promise of a storm. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken desires, with fear and anticipation. Caterina knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice, poised between the life she had always known and a future she could barely imagine. Beneath the scars of loyalty, beneath the fear and the doubt, a spark of something new was beginning to ignite, a dangerous, forbidden flame that threatened to consume her. She wondered if she should, or even could, put it out. Chapter 7. The Dance of Shadows and Secrets. The island emerged from the mist like a phantom, a jagged silhouette against the pale dawn sky. It was small, volcanic, with steep cliffs rising dramatically from the sea. A single villa, perched precariously on the highest point, dominated the landscape, its white walls gleaming in the early morning light. It was a fortress, a refuge, a prison. As the boat approached, Caterina could make out more details. A small harbor, a cluster of fishing boats, a winding path leading up to the villa, terraced gardens clinging to the slopes, the vibrant green of citrus trees contrasting with the dark, volcanic rock. The air was filled with the scent of salt, sea, and oranges. Enzo stood beside her at the railing, his hand resting lightly on her back, a possessive gesture that both irritated and strangely comforted her. He had been silent for most of the journey, lost in his own thoughts, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to Isola Nera," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "My home." Caterina didn't respond. She was still trying to process everything that had happened, to make sense of her new reality. She was a captive, a prisoner, but also something more. Enzo's words, his actions, his strange, unsettling vulnerability had created a web of confusion and conflicting emotions. The boat docked at the small harbor, and Enzo helped her ashore. A handful of men, tough-looking and heavily armed, stood waiting, their eyes watchful, their expressions wary. They were Enzo's men, his loyal soldiers, a silent reminder of the world she had been thrust into. Enzo spoke to them in rapid Italian, his voice authoritative, his tone leaving no room for argument. They nodded, their eyes flicking towards Caterina, assessing her, judging her. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, an object to be examined and evaluated. They began the ascent to the villa, following a narrow, winding path that snaked its way up the cliff face. The climb was arduous, the air thin and crisp. Caterina struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Enzo walked beside her, his hand occasionally reaching out to steady her, his touch surprisingly gentle. The villa, when they finally reached it, was even more impressive than it had appeared from the sea. It was an ancient structure, built of thick stone walls, with arched windows and a red-tiled roof. It had a timeless quality, a sense of history and secrets embedded in its very foundations. They entered through a massive wooden door, intricately carved with scenes of mythical creatures and ancient battles. The interior was cool and dim, a welcome respite from the harsh sunlight. The floors were made of polished marble, the walls adorned with tapestries and paintings, the furniture dark and heavy, with a sense of old-world elegance. Enzo led her through a series of rooms, each more opulent than the last, a grand salon with a soaring ceiling and a massive fireplace, a formal dining room with a long, gleaming table, a library filled with leather-bound books, a music room with a grand piano. It was a palace, a museum, a testament to the Costa family's wealth and power. Finally, they reached a smaller, more intimate room, overlooking the sea. It was a bedroom, decorated in soft colors, with a large four-poster bed, a comfortable armchair, and a balcony with breathtaking views. "This will be your room," Enzo said, his voice soft. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." Caterina looked around, her eyes taking in the details. It was a beautiful room, a luxurious prison cell. She walked to the balcony, leaning against the railing, gazing out at the endless expanse of the sea. She felt a profound sense of isolation, of being cut off from the world, from everything she had ever known. Enzo came up behind her, his presence filling the space, his warmth radiating towards her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his closeness, his intensity. "I know this is not what you wanted, Caterina," he said, his voice low and husky. "But I promise you, I'll make you happy here. I'll give you everything you desire." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "What I desire," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is my freedom." He smiled, a sad, almost wistful smile. "Freedom is an illusion, Caterina. We are all prisoners of something. Our past, our families, our desires." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a caress that sent a shiver down her spine. "I want you to be happy here, Caterina," he repeated, his voice earnest, pleading. "I want you to trust me." Trust. The word hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two worlds, two hearts. Could she trust him? Could she ever trust a man who had stolen her from her life, a man who was her family's sworn enemy? She didn't know. But as she looked into his eyes, into the depths of his soul, she saw something there, something that made her hesitate, that made her question everything she thought she knew. She saw pain, regret, but also a glimmer of hope, a yearning for something more, something different. The dance had begun. A dance of shadows and secrets, of fear and desire, of captivity and a strange, unexpected longing. Caterina knew she was playing a dangerous game, that she was walking a tightrope between two worlds. But she also knew that she couldn't simply surrender, that she had to fight, to resist, to find her own way, her own truth, in this new, unfamiliar landscape. And, as she looked out over that view, the sea stretching out to meet the sky, she recognized that she had already started to learn the steps. Chapter 8. A Glimmer of Forbidden Light. Days turned into weeks, and Katerina slowly began to adapt to her new life on Isolanera. The initial shock and terror gradually subsided, replaced by a strange mixture of resignation and curiosity. She was still a captive, but her captivity was far from what she had expected. Enzo treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. He gave her free rein of the villa and the surrounding gardens, allowing her to explore, to wander, to discover. He provided her with books, music, art supplies, anything she desired. He seemed determined to make her comfortable, to make her happy, to make her forget. But she couldn't forget. She couldn't forget her old life, her family, her impending marriage, the circumstances of her abduction. She couldn't forget Antonio, his memory a constant ache in her heart. She couldn't forget that Enzo was her captor, her enemy, a man who had stolen her freedom. And yet, she found herself drawn to him, fascinated by him, intrigued by the complexities of his character. He was a paradox, a man of violence and tenderness, of darkness and light. He could be ruthless, brutal, unforgiving, but he could also be gentle, considerate, even vulnerable. He spent hours with her, talking, sharing stories, revealing glimpses of his past, his hopes, his dreams. He told her about his childhood, growing up on the island, learning to sail, to fish, to navigate the treacherous waters of the Sicilian underworld. He told her about his mother, her beauty, her kindness, her tragic death. He told her about his father, a man he both admired and feared, a man who had taught him the rules of the game, the code of honor, the price of loyalty. He rarely spoke of the feud with the Espositos, but when he did, his voice was laced with bitterness and regret. He seemed to genuinely believe that the violence, the hatred, the endless cycle of revenge, was a curse, a disease that had infected both families, destroying everything in its path. He spoke often of Antonio, his voice filled with a mixture of grief and guilt. He told Katerina about their friendship, their shared dreams of a different life, their plans to escape the suffocating constraints of their families. He spoke of Antonio's love for Katerina, his unwavering devotion, his determination to protect her, to give her a better future. These conversations were both painful and illuminating. They helped Katerina to understand Enzo, to see him not just as a monster, but as a man, a flawed, complex human being, trapped by his own circumstances, his own past. She began to see glimpses of the man Antonio had loved, the man beneath the scars, the man who yearned for something more, something different. She began to see a glimmer of forbidden light in the darkness that surrounded him. One evening, they were sitting on the balcony, watching the sunset. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking spectacle of orange, pink, and purple. The sea was calm, reflecting the fiery hues of the sky, creating a mirror image of breathtaking beauty. Enzo was silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Katerina watched him, studying his profile, the strong lines of his face, the dark intensity of his eyes, the slight curve of his lips. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "It is." He reached out, his hand gently touching her hair, his fingers tracing the strands, sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't pull away. "I wish," he began, then hesitated, his voice trailing off. "You wish what?" Katerina asked, her heart beating faster. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of longing and regret. "I wish things could have been different," he said. "I wish we could have met under different circumstances." I wish he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Katerina knew what he was wishing for. He was wishing for a different past, a different present, a different future. He was wishing for a world where they weren't enemies, where they could be together, without fear, without guilt, without the weight of their families' histories. It was a foolish wish, an impossible dream. But as Katerina looked into his eyes, she felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in decades, a flicker of hope, a spark of desire. It was a dangerous feeling, a forbidden emotion. But she couldn't deny it. She was drawn to him, attracted to him, in a way she couldn't explain, couldn't control. She found herself increasingly torn between her desire for freedom and a growing, unsettling affection for the man who held her captive. It was a conflict that tore at her soul, a battle between her head and her heart, between her past and her potential future. The glimmer of light was there, but she knew that reaching for it could mean getting burned. Chapter 9. Cracked Facades and Unveiled Truths. The tranquility of Isola Nera was shattered by the arrival of a boat, a sleek, modern vessel that stood in stark contrast to the traditional fishing boats in the harbor. Katerina watched from the balcony of her room, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this arrival meant trouble, a disruption of the fragile peace she had found in her captivity. Enzo had been expecting visitors, though he hadn't told Katerina who they were or why they were coming. He had simply said that it was business, a matter that required his attention. He had become withdrawn, his mood shifting from gentle attentiveness to a brooding intensity that she found unsettling. She saw him on the docks, greeting the men who disembarked. They were dressed in expensive suits, their faces hard, their eyes watchful. They were clearly mafiosi, members of Enzo's world, a world of power, violence, and secrets. Katerina felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She was an outsider, a stranger in this world, and she knew that she was vulnerable, dependent on Enzo's protection. She didn't trust these men, didn't trust their intentions. She stayed in her room, watching from the window, trying to decipher the scene unfolding below. She saw Enzo talking to the men, his gestures animated, his voice low and urgent. They seemed to be arguing, their voices rising in anger. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could sense the tension, the conflict. After what seemed like an eternity, the men followed Enzo into the villa. Katerina retreated from the window, her heart racing. She felt trapped, exposed, like a fly caught in a spider's web. She paced the room, her mind racing. She had to know what was going on, what this meeting meant for her. She couldn't simply wait, passively accepting her fate. She decided to take a risk. She left her room, cautiously making her way down the corridor towards the grand salon where she assumed the meeting was taking place. The villa was silent, except for the muffled sound of voices coming from behind the closed doors of the salon. She reached the door, hesitating for a moment. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, that she could be discovered, punished. But her curiosity, her fear, her growing sense of unease propelled her forward. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to hear. The voices were louder now, clearer. She could make out Enzo's voice, his tone sharp, authoritative. "I told you I won't do it," he was saying. "It's out of the question." Another voice, deeper, harsher, responded. "You have no choice, Enzo. The families have agreed. It's the only way to maintain peace." "Peace?" Enzo scoffed. "There is no peace in this world, only temporary truces, bought with blood and betrayal." "The Bellini alliance is fragile," the other voice insisted. "We need to strengthen it. This marriage is the key." Katerina's blood ran cold. Marriage? What marriage were they talking about? Was it her marriage to Salvatore Bellini? Had they come to take her back? "She is mine," Enzo said, his voice dangerously low. "I will not give her up." "You have no claim on her," the other voice retorted. "She was promised to Bellini. You stole her, Enzo. You broke the code." "The code is a lie," Enzo said, his voice filled with contempt. "A tool used to control us, to perpetuate this endless cycle of violence. I'm done with it." "You are a fool." "Enzo," the other voice said, his tone menacing. "You are playing with fire. You are risking everything." "I am willing to risk everything," Enzo said, his voice unwavering. "For her." Katerina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He was talking about her. He was defying his own family, his own world, for her. The argument continued, growing more heated, more intense. Katerina listened, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling. She was the center of this conflict, the prize in a dangerous game, a game she didn't understand, a game she didn't want to play. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Enzo stood there, his face a mask of fury. He stared at Katerina, his eyes blazing with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp, cutting. Katerina shrank back, her fear returning in full force. She had been caught, exposed. She was in trouble. I was worried, she stammered, her voice trembling. I wanted to know what was going on. His anger seemed to deflate slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "Go back to your room, Katerina," he said, his voice softer now, but still firm.
"This is not your concern."
"But it is my concern," she insisted, finding a sudden surge of courage. "They were talking about me, about my marriage. I have a right to know." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, defeated. "It's complicated, Katerina," he said. "It's dangerous." "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I want to know the truth." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity, her strength. Then he nodded a slow, deliberate nod. "Come in," he said, stepping aside, allowing her to enter the salon. The cracked facades were beginning to show. And as Katerina stepped into that room, she knew that the truths she was about to uncover would change everything. The carefully constructed world Enzo had built around them was about to be tested, and she wasn't sure if it, or their fragile bond, would survive. Chapter 10. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The salon was filled with tension, a palpable sense of unease that hung heavy in the air. The three men who had arrived on the boat stood near the fireplace, their faces grim, their eyes watchful. They were strangers to Katerina, but she recognized the type. Hardened mafiosi, men who lived by a code of violence and loyalty, men who would kill without hesitation. Enzo gestured for Katerina to sit down on a sofa near the window. She obeyed, her legs trembling slightly. She felt like a lamb surrounded by wolves, a fragile creature caught in a deadly game. "These are my associates," Enzo said, his voice tight, his tone lacking its usual warmth. "This is Ricardo." He indicated a tall, thin man with a cruel face and cold, calculating eyes, "and this is Giovanni, a shorter, stockier man with a scarred face and a menacing demeanor." He didn't introduce the third man, who remained silent, his gaze fixed on Katerina, his expression unreadable. "They have come to discuss a matter of importance," Enzo continued, his voice carefully neutral. "A matter that concerns you, Katerina." Ricardo stepped forward, his eyes sweeping over Katerina, assessing her, judging her. "You are the Esposito woman," he said, his voice harsh, his tone accusatory. "The one who was promised to Salvatore Bellini." Katerina nodded, her throat dry. She couldn't speak. She felt like a prisoner on trial, facing her accusers, her judges, her executioners. "You understand the situation," Ricardo continued, his voice relentless. "Your abduction has caused complications. It has threatened the alliance between the families." "I had nothing to do with it," Katerina said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was taken against my will." Ricardo ignored her, turning to Enzo. "You have jeopardized everything." "Enzo," he said, his voice filled with anger. "You have broken the code. You have defied the families. You have brought shame upon us all." "I did what I had to do," Enzo said, his voice defiant, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "I protected what was mine." "She is not yours," Giovanni interjected, his voice gruff, his tone menacing. "She belongs to Bellini. She belongs to the families. You have no right to keep her." "I will not give her up," Enzo said, his voice unwavering, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "I will not let her be sacrificed to that monster." The third man, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried an undercurrent of authority, of power. "Enzo," he said, his eyes fixed on Katerina, "you are playing a dangerous game. You are risking everything for this woman. Is she worth it?" Enzo turned to Katerina, his eyes meeting hers. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, as if searching for something, some answer, some reassurance. "Yes," he said, his voice firm, his tone leaving no room for doubt.
"She is."
His words sent a shockwave through Katerina, a jolt of electricity that ran through her body. He was defying them all, risking everything for her. She didn't understand why. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in decades, a flicker of hope, a spark of gratitude. The men exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of anger, frustration, and resignation. They knew they couldn't force Enzo, not without a fight, not without risking a war between the families. "You are making a mistake," Enzo, Ricardo said, his voice laced with warning. "A mistake you will regret." "Perhaps," Enzo said, his voice calm, his eyes unwavering. "But it is my mistake to make." The meeting ended abruptly, the men leaving the villa, their faces grim, their departure as unsettling as their arrival. Caterina and Enzo were left alone, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words, with unasked questions, with unresolved tensions. Caterina looked at Enzo, her eyes searching his. She needed to understand, to make sense of everything that had happened.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything for me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, drained, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I told you," he said, his voice weary. "I'm doing this for Antonio."
For you.
"To give you the life you deserve."
But it's not just that, is it?
Caterina pressed, her voice gaining strength.
There's more to it than that.
You care for me, don't you?" He hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers. He looked away, his jaw tight. He didn't answer. But his silence was an answer in itself. The unspoken words hung between them, a testament to the complex, tangled emotions that bound them together. The weight of those words, the weight of their shared history, the weight of their uncertain future, pressed down on them, a heavy burden, a dangerous challenge. The facade had crumbled. The truth, in all its messy, complicated glory, was out in the open, and neither of them knew what to do with it. Chapter 11. Blood on the cobblestones. The fragile peace of Isola Nera was shattered, not by an invading force, but by a single, devastating act of betrayal. It happened in the small village near the harbor, a place Caterina had begun to explore, drawn by its rustic charm, its semblance of normalcy. She had gone there with Enzo's reluctant permission, accompanied by 2 of his men, ostensibly for her protection, but also, she suspected, to keep an eye on her. She had been browsing the stalls of the small market, admiring the colorful displays of fruits, vegetables, and local crafts. The air was filled with the scent of fresh bread, ripe oranges, and the salty tang of the sea. She had been feeling almost happy. A strange, unsettling happiness, born of her growing connection with Enzo, her gradual acceptance of her new life, her tentative steps towards a forbidden love. She had even started to believe, foolishly perhaps, that they could have a future together, a life free from the violence and the hatred that had defined their families for generations. The shot rang out, a sharp, deafening crack that echoed through the narrow, cobblestone streets. Caterina screamed, instinctively ducking for cover. Chaos erupted around her. People screamed, running in all directions, seeking shelter from the unseen danger. One of Enzo's men, the one who had been standing closest to her, fell to the ground, his body convulsing, blood pooling around him. The other man, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear, grabbed Caterina's arm, pulling her roughly towards a nearby alleyway. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, his voice hoarse, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's an ambush." They ran, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, the sound of gunfire chasing them. Caterina stumbled, her ankle twisting beneath her, sending a sharp pain shooting up her leg. She cried out, falling to her knees. The man, whose name she didn't even know, hesitated, looking back at her, his expression torn between fear and duty. He knew he should leave her, save himself, but he couldn't. Enzo would kill him if he abandoned her. He helped her up, supporting her weight, dragging her along with him. They reached the end of the alleyway, emerging onto a wider street, where a car was waiting, its engine running. They scrambled into the car, the man shoving Caterina into the back seat, jumping in after her. The driver, another of Enzo's men, sped away, the tires screeching on the pavement, the car swerving wildly through the narrow streets. Katerina lay on the back seat, her body shaking uncontrollably, her mind reeling. She had almost been killed. Someone had tried to murder her. But who?
And why?
Was it Salvatore Bellini, seeking revenge for her abduction? Was it her own family, the Espositos, trying to eliminate her, to prevent her from disrupting their plans? Or was it someone else, someone she didn't even know, someone with their own agenda, their own reasons for wanting her dead? She didn't know. But she knew one thing. Her life was in danger. And Enzo, where was Enzo? Was he safe? Was he even aware of what had happened? The car finally reached the villa, screeching to a halt in front of the massive wooden door. The man who had rescued her helped her out of the car, supporting her weight, guiding her inside. The villa was in chaos. Men were running around, shouting orders, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. The air was thick with tension, with fear, with the scent of gunpowder. Enzo appeared, his face a mask of fury, his eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. He saw Katerina, her clothes torn, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling. He rushed towards her, his hands reaching out, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Katerina, Dio, what happened?" he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. She couldn't speak. She could only sob, her body shaking uncontrollably. The man who had rescued her explained, his voice rapid, his tone urgent, describing the ambush, the shooting, the escape. Enzo listened, his expression hardening, his eyes narrowing. He turned to his men, issuing orders, his voice sharp, authoritative. He was a different man now, the gentle lover replaced by the ruthless mafioso, the man of violence, the leader of a powerful, dangerous family. He turned back to Katerina, his gaze softening slightly. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You're safe now, Dulcezza," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise you." But his promise felt hollow, empty. The blood on the cobblestones, the image of the fallen man, the sound of gunfire, the terror she had experienced had shattered the fragile illusion of safety, of peace, of a possible future. The reality of their world, the violence, the hatred, the constant threat of death, had come crashing down on them, reminding her that she was a prisoner, not just of Enzo, but of a legacy of blood and betrayal. She knew, with chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning. Chapter 12. The Price of Defiance. The villa became a fortress under siege. Enzo's men, their numbers doubled, patrolled the grounds, their weapons visible, their expressions grim. The atmosphere was thick with tension, with anticipation, with the unspoken fear of another attack. Katerina was confined to her room, ostensibly for her own safety, but she knew it was also to keep her out of the way, to prevent her from interfering with Enzo's plans. She was a prisoner again, her brief taste of freedom snatched away, replaced by the suffocating reality of her situation. She paced the room, her mind racing. She had to know what was going on, who had tried to kill her, what Enzo was planning to do. She couldn't simply wait, passively accepting her fate, a pawn in a deadly game she didn't understand. She tried to question the maids, the few remaining servants who hadn't fled in fear, but they were tight-lipped, their eyes wary, their answers evasive. They were loyal to Enzo, and they would not betray him, even to the woman he claimed to love. She spent hours staring out the window, watching the sea, the sky, the distant horizon. She longed for escape, for freedom, for a life without fear, without violence, without the constant threat of death. But she knew it was a hopeless dream, a foolish fantasy. Enzo visited her sporadically, his face drawn, his eyes tired, his mood fluctuating between tenderness and a brooding intensity that frightened her. He told her little, only assuring her that he was doing everything he could to protect her, to find out who was behind the attack, to ensure her safety. "It was Bellini," he said one evening, his voice harsh, his tone filled with anger. "He sent his men to kill you. He wants to punish me for stealing you, for defying him. Caterina shivered, her blood running cold.
Salvatore Bellini.
The man she was supposed to marry, the man she had escaped, the man who now wanted her dead. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Enzo's expression hardened. I'm going to make him pay, he said, his voice dangerously low, his eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. I'm going to make him regret the day he ever crossed me. His words sent a chill down her spine. She knew what he meant. He was going to retaliate, to strike back, to unleash the full force of his power, his violence, his ruthlessness. He was going to start a war. Enzo, no. She pleaded, her voice desperate. There has to be another way. More bloodshed, it won't solve anything. It will only make things worse. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw her fear, her concern, her desperate plea for peace. He saw the woman he loved, the woman he had sworn to protect, the woman who was now begging him to stop the cycle of violence. There is no other way, Caterina, he said, his voice weary, his tone resigned. This is the world we live in. This is the only language they understand. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was surprisingly tender, a caress that sent a shiver down her spine. I'm doing this for you, Dulcezza, he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. To protect you. To keep you safe. To make sure that no one ever threatens you again. His words were meant to reassure her, but they only filled her with dread. She knew that his actions, his violence, his defiance would have consequences. There would be a price to pay, a price that might be too high, a price that could cost them everything. She didn't want his protection, not if it meant more bloodshed, more death, more suffering. She wanted peace. She wanted freedom. She wanted a life without fear. But she knew it was a hopeless wish, a foolish dream. Their world was built on violence, on betrayal, on revenge. And Enzo, despite his love for her, despite his desire for a different life, was a product of that world, a prisoner of his own past, his own family, his own code. The price of his defiance would be high. And as Caterina looked into his eyes, into the depths of his soul, she saw the darkness gathering, the storm approaching, the inevitable clash of forces that would determine their fate. She could only watch and wait and pray that they would survive. Chapter 13. A haven in the storm. Despite the looming threat, despite the palpable tension that permeated the villa, Enzo created a sanctuary for Caterina, a small haven of peace amidst the gathering storm. He moved her to a different room, a hidden chamber deep within the ancient structure, a place where she would be safe, protected, secluded. It was a small room, but it was beautiful, with thick stone walls, a single arched window overlooking a secret garden, and a fireplace that cast a warm, flickering glow. The room was filled with books, paintings, and musical instruments, a testament to Enzo's desire to surround her with beauty, with comfort, with the things she loved. He spent as much time with her as he could, stealing moments away from the preparations for war, from the meetings with his men, from the constant demands of his position. He would sit with her, talking, reading, playing music, simply being present, offering her his companionship, his affection, his love. He told her stories of his childhood, of his adventures on the island, of his dreams for a different future. He spoke of his mother, her gentle spirit, her love of art and music, her longing for a life beyond the confines of the mafia world. He spoke of Antonio, their shared bond, their youthful idealism, their tragic fate. He rarely spoke of the impending conflict, of the threat from Bellini, of the preparations for war. He tried to shield her from the ugliness, the violence, the darkness that surrounded them. He wanted to preserve this small haven of peace, this fleeting moment of happiness, for as long as possible. Caterina responded to his tenderness, her fear gradually receding, replaced by a growing sense of trust, of affection, of love. She found herself drawn to him, captivated by him, in a way she had never thought possible. She saw the man beneath the scars, the man beneath the mask of violence, the man who yearned for something more, something different. She began to paint again, inspired by the beauty of the hidden garden, by the soft light that filtered through the arched window, by the quiet solitude of her sanctuary. She painted landscapes, portraits, still lives, pouring her emotions, her fears, her hopes, her dreams, onto the canvas. She played the piano, the melodies filling the room, echoing through the ancient walls, creating a soundtrack for their stolen moments of peace. She played the songs her mother had taught her, the songs Antonio had loved, the songs that evoked memories of a happier time, a simpler life. They shared meals together, simple but delicious, prepared by the few remaining servants who had stayed loyal to Enzo. They ate in silence, their eyes meeting across the table, their hands occasionally touching, their unspoken connection deepening with each passing day. One evening, as they were sitting by the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, Enzo turned to her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. "Caterina," he said, his voice low and husky, I love you." The words hung in the air, a simple declaration, a profound confession, a testament to the impossible love that had blossomed between them, a love born of captivity, of fear, of a shared longing for something more. Caterina's heart skipped a beat. She had known, of course, that he felt something for her, something deeper than mere affection, something more than just a desire to protect her. But to hear him say the words, to hear him confess his love, was a moment of profound significance, a turning point in their relationship. I love you too, Enzo," she said, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes filling with tears. It was the truth. She loved him, despite everything, despite his flaws, his violence, his past. She loved him for his kindness, his tenderness, his vulnerability. She loved him for the man he was and for the man he aspired to be. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, strong, reassuring. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, gentle kiss that sent a wave of warmth through her body. It was a kiss of hope, a kiss of defiance, a kiss of love. A kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their shared destiny. The storm was gathering, the darkness was closing in, but in this small haven, in this hidden chamber, in this moment of shared love, they found a refuge, a sanctuary, a glimmer of light in the encroaching shadows. They had found each other, and for now, that was all that mattered. This was their eye of the storm. They held tight, knowing it would not last. Chapter 14. Shattered Reflections. Emerging Strength. The illusion of peace, the fragile sanctuary they had created, was shattered by a single, devastating piece of news. Enzo came to Caterina's room, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, a message that had been delivered by one of his men, a message that changed everything. "It's Marco," he said, his voice hoarse, his tone filled with a chilling dread. He's betrayed us." Caterina's heart sank. Her brother. The man who had sold her into marriage, the man who had always put the family's interests above her own well-being. What had he done? "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Enzo unfolded the message, his hands shaking. He read it aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Bellini has offered an alliance, a new agreement. In exchange for Caterina's return, he will join forces with the Espositos. They will attack Isolanera. They will destroy the Costas. They will kill you." Caterina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a nightmare, a betrayal beyond comprehension. Her own brother, her own family, had allied themselves with her enemy, with the man who wanted her dead. They had condemned Enzo, the man she loved, to death. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief, with horror. "It can't be true." He couldn't, but she knew it was true. She knew Marco's ambition, his ruthlessness, his willingness to sacrifice anything, anyone, for the sake of power. Enzo crumpled the message in his fist, his face contorted with rage. "He will pay for this," he said, his voice dangerously low, his eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. "They will all pay for this." He turned to leave, his movements abrupt, his body tense with fury. He was going to war, to defend his home, his family, his life. He was going to fight, to kill, to avenge this betrayal. Enzo, wait, Katerina said, her voice desperate. She couldn't let him go. Not like this, not consumed by anger, by hatred, by a thirst for revenge. He stopped, turning back to her, his eyes searching hers. Don't do this, she pleaded, her voice filled with emotion. Don't go down this path. It will only lead to more bloodshed, more death, more suffering. There has to be another way. He looked at her, his expression torn between his love for her and his duty to his family, his code, his world. There is no other way, Katerina, he said, his voice weary, his tone resigned. This is the only way. I have to protect you. I have to protect my family. I have to fight. But you'll be killed, she cried, her voice breaking. They'll destroy everything. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was surprisingly tender, a caress that sent a shiver down her spine. I'm not afraid to die, Dulcetsa, he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a strange calmness. I'm only afraid of losing you. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, fleeting kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of goodbye, a kiss of farewell, a kiss of love. He turned and left, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Katerina alone, her heart shattered, her world crumbling around her. But as she stood there, alone in the silence, a new strength began to emerge, a fierce determination born of despair, of loss, of love. She would not be a victim, a pawn, a passive observer. She would not let them destroy everything she held dear. She would fight. She would resist. She would find a way to stop this madness, to save Enzo, to save herself, to forge a new path, a new future, from the ashes of the old. The reflection she saw in the window's glass was no longer of a woman trapped, but a woman resolved. The image was fractured, yes, but it was fierce. It was strong. It was ready. Chapter 15. The Ghosts of Via D'Amelio. Katerina knew she had to act quickly. Enzo had left to rally his men, to prepare for the inevitable attack. She was alone, but she wasn't helpless. She had to find a way to reach out, to warn someone, to stop the impending bloodshed. She remembered the old radio transmitter in Enzo's study, a relic from his father's days, a way to communicate with the outside world, bypassing the usual channels, the monitored lines. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. She left the hidden chamber, making her way through the silent villa. The servants had fled, the guards were gone, deployed to defend the perimeter. The house felt empty, haunted, a ghost of its former self. She reached the study, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed the door behind her, locking it, creating a temporary barrier against the outside world. The room was dark, filled with shadows, the air thick with the scent of old books, leather, and gunpowder. She found the radio transmitter, hidden behind a bookshelf, a bulky, antiquated piece of equipment. She had seen Enzo use it once, a brief demonstration of its capabilities. She remembered the sequence, the frequencies, the codes. She switched it on, the tubes warming up, emitting a faint hum. She adjusted the dials, her hands trembling slightly. She spoke into the microphone, her voice hesitant, her words a desperate plea. This is Katerina Esposito, she said, her voice echoing in the silence. I am on Isolanera, at the Costa Villa. There is going to be an attack. My brother, Marco Esposito, has allied with Salvatore Bellini. They are planning to kill Enzo Costa. They are planning to destroy everything. She repeated the message, her voice gaining strength, her tone more urgent. She didn't know who was listening, if anyone was listening, but she had to try. She had to do something. She waited, her breath held captive in her chest, listening for a response, for a sign that someone had heard her, that someone would help. The silence stretched, agonizing, filled only with the static hiss of the radio. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the speaker, a faint, distorted voice, barely audible. Repeat message, who's speaking? Katerina's heart leaped with hope. Someone had heard her. Someone was listening. She repeated her message, her voice clearer now, more confident. She provided details, coordinates, names, anything that might help. The voice responded again, stronger this time, more distinct. "We understand message received assistance on way the connection was broken, the static returning, the silence descending once more." But Katerina felt a surge of relief, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She had done it. She had reached out. She had warned someone. She had taken action. She didn't know who had received her message, who was coming to help, but she knew that she had done everything she could. She had broken the silence. She had defied her family. She had risked everything for the man she loved. She switched off the radio, her hands still trembling. She left the study, making her way back to the hidden chamber, her sanctuary, her prison. She sat by the window, gazing out at the sea, the sky, the distant horizon. The ghosts of the past swirled around her, the memories of Antonio, of her mother, of her lost life, of the violence and the hatred that had defined her world. She remembered a specific memory, one she had long suppressed. It was a memory from her youth, a visit to Palermo with her father. They had been driving down Via d'Amelio, a street that held a dark significance in the history of the mafia. It was the site of an infamous bombing, a brutal act of violence that had claimed the lives of a judge and his bodyguards. Her father had pointed to the wreckage, the scorched buildings, the shattered remnants of a life destroyed. He had spoken of the price of defiance, of the consequences of betrayal, of the endless cycle of revenge. "This is what happens, Katerina," he had said, his voice cold, his eyes devoid of emotion. "This is what happens when you cross the families. This is what happens when you break the code." The memory haunted her, a chilling reminder of the world she had been born into, the world she had tried to escape, the world that was now threatening to consume her and the man she loved. The ghosts of Via d'Amelio were here, on this island, in this villa, in her heart. But she was not afraid. She had faced her fears. She had defied her family. She had chosen love over loyalty, hope over despair. She had found her strength, her courage, her voice. And she would not be silenced. She would not be defeated. She would fight to the very end. The message had been sent. Now, all she could do was wait and hope help made it in time. Chapter 16. The Razor's Edge of Trust. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against Katerina's frayed nerves. She paced the hidden chamber, her mind racing, her imagination conjuring up all manner of terrifying scenarios. Had her message been received? Had anyone believed her? Would help arrive in time? Or was she doomed to witness the destruction of everything she held dear, the death of the man she loved? She tried to distract herself, to focus on something, anything, other than the impending doom. She picked up a book, but she couldn't concentrate, the words blurring before her eyes. She tried to paint, but her hand trembled, the colors mixing into a muddy, chaotic mess. She tried to play the piano, but the melodies sounded discordant, jarring, reflecting the turmoil within her. Finally, she gave up, surrendering to the anxiety, the fear, the agonizing uncertainty. She sat by the window, gazing out at the sea, the sky, the distant horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, a breathtaking spectacle of beauty that contrasted starkly with the darkness gathering within her, around her. Suddenly, she heard a sound, a distant rumble, a faint vibration that resonated through the ancient walls of the villa. She held her breath, listening intently. The sound grew louder, closer, more distinct. It was the sound of helicopters. She leaped to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. Hope surged through her, a wave of relief so intense that it almost brought her to her knees. Someone had heard her. Someone was coming. She ran to the window, peering out, straining to see. She saw them, 3 black helicopters, approaching the island, their blades churning the air, their powerful engines roaring like angry beasts. They were not Bellini's men. These were different. She didn't know who they were, but she knew they were not her enemies. They were her saviors, her rescuers, a glimmer of light in the encroaching darkness. But as quickly as hope had flared, it was replaced by a new fear, a chilling realization. Enzo. Where was Enzo? He was out there, somewhere preparing for battle, unaware of this new development, unaware that help was on the way. He would see the helicopters, he would assume they were his enemies, he would fight. And he would be outnumbered, outgunned, overwhelmed. She had to warn him. She had to reach him. She had to stop him from walking into a trap, from sacrificing himself, from throwing his life away. She ran from the hidden chamber, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had to find him. She had to warn him. She had to save him. She burst out of the villa, into the open air. The helicopters were closer now, circling the island, preparing to land. She saw Enzo, standing on the cliffs, his men gathered around him, their weapons drawn, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the approaching aircraft. He saw her, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. He shouted something, his voice lost in the roar of the engines, but she knew what he was saying. He was telling her to go back inside, to stay safe, to hide. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. She had to reach him. She had to warn him. She had to save him. She ran towards him, her footsteps echoing on the rocky ground, her voice screaming his name, her desperate plea lost in the deafening noise.
Enzo.
Stop. They're not the enemy. He didn't hear her. He couldn't hear her. He raised his hand, signaling his men to fire. Katerina screamed again, a piercing cry of despair, of anguish, of love. She saw the flash of gunfire, the tracer bullets streaking through the air, the helicopters returning fire, the deafening roar of explosions. She was caught in the crossfire, a deadly dance of violence, of chaos, of destruction. She was standing on a razor's edge, a precarious balance between hope and despair, between life and death, between love and loss. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that everything was about to change. Her trust, Enzo's life, and the future were all hanging by a thread. Chapter 17. When Masks Fall Away. The world exploded around Katerina in a cacophony of gunfire, explosions, and screams. She saw Enzo's men fall, their bodies riddled with bullets, their lives extinguished in an instant. She saw Enzo, his face contorted with rage, firing his weapon at the helicopters, a futile gesture of defiance against overwhelming force. She ran towards him, dodging bullets, stumbling over fallen bodies, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind screaming his name. She had to reach him, she had to stop him, she had to save him. But it was too late. She saw him fall, his body struck by a hail of bullets, his weapon slipping from his grasp, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment, a look of surprise, of pain, of love. Enzo! She screamed, her voice a raw, desperate cry of anguish. She collapsed beside him, cradling his head in her lap, her hands pressing against his wounds, trying to staunch the flow of blood, her tears streaming down her face, mixing with the crimson stain that spread across his shirt. No, 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 she sobbed, her voice broken, her body shaking uncontrollably. Please, Enzo, don't leave me.
Please don't die.
He looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of tenderness and regret. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak, barely a whisper. Katerina, I love you. His eyes closed, his body went limp, his breath ceased. He was gone. Katerina's world shattered. Her heart broke. Her soul cried out in agony. She had lost everything. The man she loved, the future she had dreamed of, the hope she had clung to, it was all gone, extinguished in a moment of brutal violence. She remained there, kneeling beside his body, cradling him in her arms, oblivious to the chaos around her, to the gunfire, the explosions, the screams. She was lost in her grief, in her despair, in her overwhelming sense of loss. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder, a firm, gentle grip that pulled her away from Enzo's body. She looked up, her eyes blurred with tears, her vision distorted. She saw a man, standing over her, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and authority. He was dressed in a military uniform, a stranger, but she recognized the insignia on his shoulder. He was not one of Bellini's men. He was not one of Enzo's men. He was something else. "Signora Esposito," he said, his voice calm, his tone reassuring. "We're here to help you. We received your message." Caterina stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend. Help? What help? It was too late. Enzo was dead. Everything was lost. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We're with the Italian government," he said. "A special task force. We've been investigating the Esposito and Bellini families for years. Your message, it gave us the evidence we needed to act." Caterina didn't understand. She didn't care. All she cared about was Enzo, his lifeless body lying beside her, his blood staining the ground. "It's too late," she said, her voice hollow, her tone devoid of emotion.
He's dead."
The man looked at Enzo's body, his expression softening. "I'm sorry, Signora," he said. "We did everything we could." He signaled to his men, who began to secure the area, rounding up the remaining combatants, tending to the wounded. The helicopters landed, disgorging more soldiers, their presence bringing a semblance of order to the chaos. Caterina remained there, kneeling beside Enzo, her hand resting on his cold cheek, her tears still flowing. She felt numb, empty, devoid of all emotion except for a profound sense of grief, of loss, of despair. The man in the uniform approached her again, his voice gentle, his tone compassionate. "Signora Esposito," he said, "we need to get you to safety. We need to get you away from here." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and resistance. "No," she said, her voice weak but firm. "I won't leave him. I won't leave Enzo." The man sighed, understanding her grief, her reluctance to leave the man she loved. "Signora," he said, his voice patient, his tone persuasive, "we need to take him with us. We need to investigate his death. We need to bring those responsible to justice." Caterina hesitated. She didn't want to leave Enzo, but she knew he was right. She had to let him go. She had to allow them to take his body, to investigate his death, to seek justice for his murder. The task force leader gently held out his hand. "I am Antonioni. Special Investigator Antonioni,"
he said.
And in that moment, when the masks of enemies and allies had fallen away, a stunning truth came to light. The special investigator shared a name with her first love. As she met his eyes, the same laughing eyes that had once stolen her heart with stolen kisses and whispered promises long ago, Caterina knew it couldn't be a coincidence. She slowly reached out, placing her hand with his. Chapter 18. The Reckoning of Old Sins. The days that followed were a blur of grief, confusion, and revelation. Caterina was taken to a safe house, a secluded villa in the Tuscan countryside, far from the violence and the chaos of Isola Nera. She was under the protection of the Italian government, of Special Investigator Antonioni, the man who bore the name of her first love, the man who had rescued her from the carnage. She learned the truth, the full, shocking truth, about Enzo's death, about her family's betrayal, about the intricate web of lies, deceit, and manipulation that had defined her life. Antonioni, it turned out, was not just a namesake of her lost love. He was Antonio, miraculously alive, his death faked decades ago, his identity concealed, his life dedicated to bringing down the very mafia families that had destroyed his past, his happiness, his love. He had been working undercover, infiltrating the Esposito and Bellini families, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. Caterina's message, her desperate plea for help, had been the catalyst, the trigger that had set the operation in motion. He had known about Enzo, about his connection to Antonio, about his love for Caterina. He had known that Enzo was a target, that he was in danger. He had tried to reach him, to warn him, but it had been too late. Enzo's death had been a tragic mistake, a consequence of miscommunication, of faulty intelligence, of the fog of war. He had died a hero, defending his home, his family, the woman he loved. But he had died believing that help was the enemy, that Caterina had betrayed him. Caterina was devastated by this revelation, her grief compounded by guilt, by remorse, by the agonizing knowledge that Enzo had died thinking she had betrayed him. She had to live with the weight of that misunderstanding, with the crushing burden of his final, unspoken accusation. She also learned the full extent of her family's treachery. Marco, her brother, had orchestrated the alliance with Bellini, driven by ambition, by greed, by a ruthless desire for power. He had been willing to sacrifice Caterina, to condemn Enzo, to unleash a war, all for the sake of his own twisted agenda. Her father, too, had been complicit, his silence a form of consent, his inaction a betrayal of his own daughter. He had known about Antonio's faked death, about his undercover operation, about the impending attack. He had done nothing to stop it. The old sins, the ancient feuds, the endless cycle of violence and revenge had finally caught up with them all. The reckoning had come, and the price had been devastating. Caterina confronted her brother, her father, in a series of emotional, heart-wrenching meetings. She demanded answers. She accused them of their crimes. She expressed her rage, her grief, her utter disillusionment. Marco, arrogant and defiant to the end, denied everything, blaming Enzo, blaming Caterina, blaming anyone but himself. He showed no remorse, no regret, only a cold, calculating determination to survive, to salvage what he could from the wreckage of his ambition. Her father, broken and defeated, confessed everything, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with tears. He admitted his guilt, his complicity, his failure to protect his daughter, to prevent the tragedy. He begged for forgiveness, but Caterina could not give it. The wounds were too deep, the betrayal too profound. The Italian government, armed with the evidence gathered by Antonioni, launched a massive crackdown on the mafia families. Arrests were made, assets were seized, indictments were handed down. The old order, the corrupt system of power and violence, began to crumble. Caterina testified against her brother, her father, her testimony a crucial part of the prosecution's case. She spoke the truth, the whole truth, exposing their crimes, their lies, their betrayals. It was a painful, agonizing process, but it was also a cathartic one, a way to reclaim her voice, to assert her identity, to break free from the shackles of her past. The reckoning of old sins had come. The price had been high, the wounds were deep, but the truth had finally emerged, and justice, however imperfect, however delayed, was finally being served. The question now was, where did she go from here? Chapter 19. A Love Forged in Fire. The trials were over. Marco was sentenced to life in prison, his ambition shattered, his power extinguished. Her father, spared a lengthy sentence due to his cooperation, was a broken man, his legacy tarnished, his life in ruins. The Esposito and Bellini families, once powerful and feared, were decimated, their influence shattered, their empires crumbling. Caterina was free. Free from her family, free from the mafia, free from the suffocating constraints of her past. But she was also alone, adrift, her heart aching with grief, her soul scarred by loss. Antonioni, his mission accomplished, his identity revealed, was no longer a special investigator, a ghost from her past. He was Antonio, the boy she had loved, the man she had mourned, the man who had miraculously returned to her life. But their reunion was not a fairy tale ending. It was complicated, messy, fraught with pain, with guilt, with the ghosts of their shared past, with the shadow of Enzo's death hanging over them. They spent time together, talking, sharing memories, trying to bridge the decades of separation, the years of lies, deceit, and misunderstanding. They walked the Tuscan countryside, visited the ancient ruins, explored the vibrant cities, seeking solace in the beauty of their surroundings, in the familiarity of their shared heritage. Antonio told her about his life, his training, his undercover work, his constant fear of discovery, his unwavering determination to bring down the mafia families that had destroyed their lives. He spoke of his regret, his guilt, his inability to save Enzo, his failure to protect Katerina sooner. Katerina listened, her heart aching for him, for his lost years, for his sacrifices, for his unwavering commitment to justice. She saw the man he had become, the strength he had forged, the scars he carried, the price he had paid. She also told him about her life, her arranged marriage, her abduction, her captivity, her growing love for Enzo, her grief over his death. She spoke of her confusion, her fear, her gradual acceptance of her new reality, her forbidden feelings for a man who was both her captor and her savior. It was a painful, difficult conversation, a delicate dance of truth and reconciliation, of forgiveness and understanding. They had both been victims, both been scarred, both been caught in a web of violence and betrayal. But amidst the pain, the guilt, the regret, there was also something else. A spark of hope, a flicker of rekindled love, a yearning for a second chance, a desire to heal, to rebuild, to create a new life together. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace of the villa, watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, Antonio turned to Katerina, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty. "Katerina," he said, his voice low and husky, I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving. I know about Enzo." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands, his voice faltering. "But I still love you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've always loved you. I've never stopped loving you." Katerina's heart skipped a beat. She had known, of course, that he still felt something for her, something deeper than mere friendship, something more than just a shared past. But to hear him say the words, to hear him confess his enduring love, was a moment of profound significance, a turning point in their relationship. I love you too, Antonio," she said, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes filling with tears. It was the truth. She loved him. She had always loved him, but her love for him was different now, tempered by time, by loss, by the shared experience of trauma and resilience. It was a love forged in fire, a love tested by adversity, a love that had survived the ravages of time and betrayal. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, strong, reassuring. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, gentle kiss that sent a wave of warmth through her body. It was a kiss of healing, a kiss of hope, a kiss of forgiveness. A kiss that sealed their reunion, their commitment, their shared future. It wouldn't be easy. They had a long road ahead of them, a journey of healing, of reconciliation, of rebuilding. They had to confront the ghosts of their past, to overcome the obstacles in their path, to navigate the complexities of their rekindled love. But they were not alone. They had each other. They had their shared history, their shared love, their shared determination to create a new life, a life free from violence, from fear, from the suffocating constraints of their past. They had a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity, a love that had survived betrayal, loss, and grief. And that love, they knew, would be their strength, their guide, their salvation. Chapter 20. The Dawn of a New Allegiance. A year passed. A year of healing, of rebuilding, of rediscovering themselves and each other. Katerina and Antonio remained in Tuscany, far from the shadows of Sicily, far from the memories of violence and betrayal. They lived a quiet life, a simple life, surrounded by beauty, by peace, by the tranquility of the countryside. They renovated the villa, transforming it from a safe house into a home, a sanctuary filled with light, with warmth, with love. They planted a garden, tending to the flowers, the herbs, the vegetables, nurturing life, cultivating beauty, finding solace in the simple rhythms of nature. They explored the surrounding countryside, walking hand in hand through the rolling hills, visiting the ancient villages, discovering the hidden treasures of their adopted home. They learned to live in the present, to appreciate the small moments, to cherish the simple joys of life. They also worked, using their combined knowledge, their experience, their connections to help others, to fight for justice, to prevent the kind of tragedies they had endured. They established a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of mafia violence, to providing education, to promoting peace, to building a better future. They became advocates, speaking out against organized crime, sharing their stories, inspiring others to break the silence, to defy the code of omerta, to seek justice and reconciliation. They became symbols of hope, of resilience, of the power of love to overcome adversity. They often spoke of Enzo, remembering him with a mixture of grief and gratitude. They acknowledged his sacrifice, his love for Caterina, his tragic fate. They honored his memory by working to create the kind of world he had dreamed of, a world free from violence, from fear, from the suffocating constraints of the mafia. Caterina found peace in painting, her art becoming a form of therapy, a way to express her emotions, to process her grief, to celebrate her newfound freedom. She painted landscapes, portraits, still lives, her canvases filled with vibrant colors, with light, with hope. Antonio found solace in writing, documenting his experiences, exposing the inner workings of the mafia, revealing the truth about his past, his undercover operation, his miraculous survival. He wrote a book, a memoir, a testament to the power of resilience, of forgiveness, of love. Their relationship deepened, their love growing stronger with each passing day. They learned to trust each other, to rely on each other, to support each other through the inevitable challenges, the lingering shadows of their past. One spring morning, as they were sitting on the terrace of the villa, overlooking the garden, the sun warming their faces, the birds singing their cheerful melodies, Antonio turned to Caterina, his eyes filled with a love that took her breath away. "Caterina," he said, his voice low and husky, "will you marry me?" He held out a ring, a simple band of gold, a symbol of his enduring love, his unwavering commitment, his hope for a future together. Caterina's heart overflowed with joy. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of happiness, of gratitude, of love. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling slightly, her smile radiant. "Yes, Antonio, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a symbol of their perfect union. He leaned closer, his lips meeting hers, a soft, gentle kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment, their love. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, a dawn of a new allegiance. An allegiance not to family, not to power, not to a code of violence, but to each other, to love, to justice, to peace. They had survived the storm, they had overcome the darkness, they had found their way back to each other. They had forged a new life, a new love, a new future, from the ashes of the old. And as they stood there, hand in hand, bathed in the golden light of the Tuscan sun, they knew that their journey had just begun. They had each other and an entire lifetime to look forward to. The dawn broke, casting away all the remaining shadows.
Epilogue.
The wedding was small, intimate, a gathering of close friends, of trusted allies, of those who had supported them through their journey. It was held in the garden of the villa, amidst the blooming flowers, the fragrant herbs, the lush greenery they had cultivated together. Caterina wore a simple white dress, her silver-streaked hair flowing freely down her back, her face radiant with happiness, her eyes shining with love. Antonio wore a dark suit, his smile warm, his gaze tender, his heart overflowing with gratitude. They exchanged vows, their voices clear, their words heartfelt, their promises echoing through the tranquil air. They pledged their love, their loyalty, their commitment to each other, to a future filled with hope, with peace, with joy. They celebrated with their guests, sharing laughter, stories, and delicious food, the atmosphere filled with warmth, with friendship, with a sense of shared triumph over adversity. They danced under the stars, their bodies swaying to the music, their hearts beating as one. As the evening drew to a close, and the guests began to depart, Caterina and Antonio found themselves alone, standing on the terrace, overlooking the garden, the Tuscan countryside bathed in the soft glow of the moon. Caterina leaned against Antonio, her head resting on his shoulder, her arm wrapped around his waist. She felt a sense of profound contentment, of peace, of belonging. She had found her home, her sanctuary, her love. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. Antonio nodded, his gaze sweeping over the landscape, his heart filled with gratitude. "Yes," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "It is." He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks. "Thank you, Katerina," he said, his voice filled with love. "Thank you for coming back to me. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Thank you for everything." Katerina smiled, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "Thank you, Antonio," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me." They kissed, a long, slow, passionate kiss, a seal of their enduring love, their unwavering commitment, their shared future. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of hope. A kiss that promised a lifetime of happiness, of peace, of love. They stood there, embraced, for a long time, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, two souls reunited, two hearts entwined, two lives forever bound together. They had survived the storm. They had overcome the darkness. They had found their way back to each other. They had created a new life, a new love, a new legacy, from the ashes of the old. And as they looked out at the horizon, at the dawn of a new day, they knew that their journey, their love story, was just beginning. A future stretched out before them, long and beautiful, and theirs.